Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. On this beautiful, breezy spring summer afternoon here in Southern California. Officially, the temperature is about 69, but in the sun, it's about 73 to 5, so it's kind of nice. This concludes your weather update. So today, I'm going to talk about something rather, I guess I could say esoteric, a little out of the norm, but it's something that's happened to me after I've detoxed out of probably at least two substances, one being fluoride, to the best of my ability, and because, I drink tea at restaurants and shit, so you still get a little bit of it, but I don't brush with it. Getting out of aspartame, eating more GMO-free stuff. That sounded horrible. And I think doing this show, thinking more, the way that you make your brain bigger is to think. That's how synapses decide to procreate. It's all based on the electrical use of the synapse that you have. And so if you think a lot, they get exacerbated to the point where I shouldn't be on this much. Eject a little piece of the nuclei out into the brain cavity, the neurons, the neural connections attached to it to protect it, and you get a little extra circuit, a little extra transistor in your brain. And I've said a couple times on the show, I want to remind you guys that the big deal is that you start to think better. And you start to think better so much that it's disturbing at first. Now, at least for me, it was like I felt like I was sort of at the peak of being able to kind of consciously digest, which actually brings into question sort of the difference between the image in your brain of how much data you have retrieved from long-term storage or taken in from your five senses at any one moment when you paint the picture in front of you, and then you're having to, almost as your soul, deal with the picture. It's a very interesting thing. It's kind of how I feel about it. It's like I have two levels of what builds consciousness for me: information and the ability to process it. I have never had, until I detoxed, more processor power than an overwhelming amount of processor power versus the amount of information I was taking in. When that became extremely imbalanced, and I would say again, it hit me one day driving somewhere here, and I left my house and I was hitting an intersection on the other side of my block, and I remember just looking around and my brain was on fucking fire. Absolutely, just, it had taken all of reality and eaten it in like a nanosecond and needed, more. And I'll tell you that the substance I was ingesting the most, because I didn't ingest a lot of fluoride, right? You brush your teeth twice a day or whatever. And then we drink, water. I don't drink tap water, never really have, so that wasn't a real source for me, other than restaurants, right, that mix it with sodas and mix it with tea and that kind of stuff. But the thing I probably detoxed out of the most was aspartame. Fake sugars. All of them. I got rid of my microwave. And luckily I had a partner that understood. She was like, yeah, I've been trying to get you to go healthy for a long time. I didn't know anything about this weird stuff you're telling me, but I'm willing to do it because I think we should go more natural. And I'm like, yeah. And neither one of us are like crunchy hippies or anything. My hair was short at the time. But it's been 13 years since I did that. 2005, now it's 2018. And I can tell you over the last year, I've had some advancement in my understanding of how my own brain works. And I want to share it with you just in case you have this, because it might make you a lot more powerful. And I'm calling it observed consciousness. And I'm going to try to get the definition out as quickly as possible so that we can start talking about it. I have no idea. I'm going to talk about this for an hour. We'll see. With this extra processor power, what I've been able to do in my own brain is sort of get a physical separation of my various processes in my brain. What does that mean? Well, I got a computer in front of me. It's recording this conversation. Got the camera over there. And this is all creating a consciousness for you so that when you listen to it back, all this marries together. Got the microphone right down here, my little mixing box right there. Some power supplies, make sure I don't run out of power. Got the sun lighting it up for those of you watching. And so we're creating, I'm gathering and creating a reality here so that you can have it. And then I take it in the back room and I edit it. So there's a physical location thing going on when you're in real life. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I had for myself was that I always thought I was one thing. It's just me right here. I still have all my limbs. But we know that people lose limbs. They lose fingers and digits, and in more horrific situations, they'll lose an arm and a leg or something. If they don't pass out after that process, there has to be this moment of epiphany when you look at your finger over there and you're over here, and that thing has been with you your entire life. And yes, every cell in your body dies and renews within 7 years, they say, so perhaps you've known that thumb or that whatever for 7 years, but its nervous system, its touch, its sense has always been with you, and now it's going to start to disappear as your brain remaps that region to something else. Well, that's an easier one to wrap your mind around because it's physical. You have other physical pieces of proof that when you demo something, you destroy a table because you're going to throw it away, or cut a box apart because it won't fit in the trash can, you're cutting it to pieces. The tomato that you cut into pieces, and hey, you cut it into 6 pieces, six different people in the room can enjoy the taste of a single thing. Isn't that interesting, right? But now when I say how many pieces and parts exist for a thought in your brain, we don't ask that question, do we? It's all one thing. It's like a stream of consciousness. It's me, it's it, it's that. And I have discovered that, at least in my mind, it's a bunch of different pieces. My soul is sort of the deepest part of my consciousness, it being represented as a camera. And so I am looking at this world from like the back of my head and even beyond the back of where my skull is, because that's sort of whatever I am, it's coming in and watching. Yes, it's coalescing all the 5 senses to create another image. But I am talking about setting aside the fact that I can feel a slightly cool wind on my body right now. I can feel stripes of heat on my flesh right now. I can taste this Babalu cigar. But within my brain, within my consciousness, I should say, I have very segregated things that I'm starting to feel their physical difference. What is any brain made out of in the most layman's terms? You have long-term memory and short-term memory. It's usually discussed in a way that your short-term memory is what's on your mind right now. What are you thinking about? What just happened to you? You kind of have this little gestalt that's kind of rolling constantly, right? Long-term memory is where you go back and you think about those Christmas cookies that your grandma used to make before she passed away. And isn't it a shame that no one has that recipe anymore, right? I used to, put it this way, ever since I saw those data centers where robot arms go all over the place and grab various storage units and move them and put them into a play mechanism, I've always thought of my long-term memory as some sort of system like that, except it obviously moves at some light speed thing. So to recap, because I'm going to give you the fourth one, which I think is where observed reality comes into play here. So my soul feels like a camera looking at whatever I'm able to harvest out of reality. And again, I'm really talking about consciousness, not the physicality of everything, right? I feel sort of like the TARDIS Doctor Who basement with all my long-term memory in there. And to the degree I keep the mechanism of grabbing that memory really fluent, it works really quickly. But if I don't go back and get stuff on a routine basis, it's like it gets a little rusty. It takes a little longer the next time. And then you have your consciousness, the short-term 10-minute loop that's in there, and you sort of have in that, the priority one things that you're thinking about. And there's, it's, when you send an email, whether you guys have ever used the feature before, there's like a priority list you can actually set, small, medium, high, or whatever. When you set it to high, the person on the other side gets a big red exclamation point. It's kind of nice. So something exciting is happening, or even more poignantly, something dangerous is happening to you. Well, that level of consciousness wipes out everything else until that situation is resolved, and you can go back to your normal sort of full spectrum process, right, of thinking. But the reason why I'm making this episode is that over the last year, I have started to master a new method of looking at information that in the past I thought were my thoughts. And there's probably someone who's figured this out and has a completely different name for it. Please let me know in the suggestions. But I've never had anyone parse consciousness to any major degree besides a bunch of, exhibitionistic wordsmithing from philosophers just trying to sound smart, right? There's some irony in that sentence, wasn't there? For me, when I would look at my consciousness throughout the day in the past, and talking about maybe 47 years of doing this, I thought that if something came into my head, it was mine. It was my thought that I was having. And, like I said in a recent episode that's not out yet, but I did, it didn't account for the fact that when I wrote screenplays, that the characters lived by themselves. And it seemed like they lived outside my consciousness. And the idea was, well, everything that's inside me, isn't it mine? Aren't I the one creating all the thoughts that I'm having? Is it possible for me to have a thought inside my consciousness, quote unquote, physical location noted, right, that isn't mine? Don't we have this idea that it's all ours? But in the physical world, as soon as you step outside the paradigm of consciousness in your own brain, well, shit happens all the time. It's not me. The jet just flew over. I'm not flying that thing, and I'm not in it. And the car just drove by because it's a nice day, Huntington Beach. Everyone's getting out their hot rods. I'm not them. I'm not controlling the noise that their car is making and their motorcycle is making. So in the physical world, you have all kinds of things that occur to you and around you that aren't you, and you accept it every single day. But for some reason, we think that everything that's inside of our head is 100% our property, our cause. I am discovering that we observe consciousness in large percentages. That we have thoughts that come through our head that do use the players of our play, that you observe, but it's not your thought. It is simply something that is occurring to you, and you're looking at it. You don't own it. It's not in your memory banks of having occurred because it's a speculative situation, a thought. It's sort of like the Philip K. Dick stream of consciousness, the river of consciousness that he talked about. The reason why I want to mention this is because over the last year, and I think large part due to this show and just talking to you guys and expanding the mind and trying to find new episodes in my head, and it has probably allowed me to discern things. Talking about dreams has allowed me to parse reality better. You gain a lot of sovereign identity by understanding that you can have conscious thoughts, or at least observable images of consciousness, go through your head, and you don't have to own them as your character. I'll give you an example. I think anyone who drives a vehicle has had a minor road rage thing inside your head. You know, I think 99.9% of us never flipped the bird. But just something happens where someone's being oblivious to the universe or being rude specifically, and you will envision something or see something in your head that is way beyond the capacity of your character to enact. Something dark. Wishing someone harm. I'm using a car thing because I could say a random moment in time when someone offends you or pisses you off, right? It also happens for all the positive realms too. You see a pretty person and you have all these visions of doing things with them. Some of that might cross over into your own ownership, your own instigating of the thought. But now, well, let me finish up this particular first take on this. If you believed you owned every thought, every piece of consciousness that ever came through your mind's eye, you might feel very guilty about the kind of thoughts that you can have. You think that you're seeing deeper into your own soul. What I'm going to suggest is, especially after practicing it for a good year, is once you realize it's not you, that you're merely looking into some telescope or microscope into eventualities that I guess technically could happen in some cases. Probably a bunch of them can't happen at all. And when you realize they're external to you, you no longer shape and mold your own self-image based on these random occurrences in your consciousness. For instance, have you ever had this statement in your mind or heard someone tell you, man, I have these thoughts and I can't stop them and they're just dark and I just can't, Or, it could be lustful thinking towards someone's wife or husband and they're married and you like both of them. You would never do anything to hurt them. And so you have that, like the Jesse's Girl song sort of thing, right? Or again, someone pisses you off and the retaliation in your brain is so insane that you just go, oh my God, do I have this darkness in me? There's a lot of people who get tattoos to express their inner darkness, that they feel like they have this marriage with this dark side on the inside because they are capable of seeing these things and they think, oh, that must be me. It's inside me. So I'm going to get big skull and bones on my arm. What if they're just simply seeing what they allow themselves to see? And by misunderstanding, they meld it with their personality, or they fear that that's who they really are. And every day that they wake up and they see more, they observe these other levels of consciousness, these other storylines. I shouldn't say levels, but storylines. They think that it's some beacon of who they really are, right? I just kind of said that twice, but what if you could go up to that person and say, it's not you. All you're doing is opening up your mind to be able to see over there a scenario. But in the same way that you might go to a bar to get a drink and there's a bar brawl and all kinds of people get hurt and whatever, you were there, you saw it, but when you go home, you think you're lucky stars. You're not a person who would start a fight. You're not a person who would bring a gun to a bar or whatever, and you feel better the next day because you know it's external to who you are. But if you're at the bar and no brawl breaks out, but you have some guy who's drunk and annoying and he offended you, your girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, and you have those brawly, shooty thoughts towards that person, the next morning you might wake up and go, God, what kind of monster am I? thinking that you drew it from the bowels of your own identity. What I have been doing for the majority of my life, without really knowing it, is I have been owning every single observed consciousness, every single thought that's ever gone through my head. I immediately thought that I owned it, that I made it happen, and that somehow I need to reconcile the fact that I must be this person. And over the last year, what happens to me, and I will tell you this too, it starts to slow down the more that you shun it. This uncontrollable seeing of things that you would never want to see in your head. It's almost as if there's a bit of a game being played on our consciousness. And I'm gonna take a little diversion after I get done here into maybe some sort of metaphor of Satan. I don't necessarily believe Satan exists or anything like that, but it's going to be interesting. Some mechanism, right? But the more that these things occur, it took a while. And I still have to play with it a little bit, but something will pop in my head. And it's usually something that's, I should say this, it's really noticeable once the thought is sort of really deviant from what your normal thoughts are. It doesn't have to be super dark, doesn't have to be super light. It just is one of these things of, like, you're almost overhearing a visual conversation. You're not hearing any voices in your head, but I think about homeless people who have gone feral due to a lack of nutrition and food and attention. They're hearing voices, they're talking, and they're just trying to survive. I've seen plenty of little videos from mental institutions where people think that aliens are talking to them, and I've always wanted to have the ability to go into some study with these individuals and treat them as if they're not crazy and go, what are you hearing? You're well fed now, you're protected, what are you hearing? Tell me. And some people have done this. I've seen in one video, and they simply couldn't make any sense out of what the person was saying, but then it's like, are we deciphering hieroglyphs? We just need to figure out how they're using language differently. It's interesting, right? One of the other things, before I go into this evil methodology with this, is that we are physically taught, our perception of ourselves is usually taught as, you're just this bag of chemicals, you're all by yourself. If you were sitting over here listening to me instead of watching this through a YouTube video, you have your own bag of chemicals over there, I got my bag of chemicals over here, and there's nothing transmitting between the two of us, right? You have your own thing, and I can instill ideas in you by using, audio to talk to you, my facial expressions, whatever, and you have yours to me. But we are never taught to think of ourselves as a stream of consciousness, which is what I promote on this show. And we've proven it, again, with the 10-monkey experiment. We have proven that we communicate without speaking. We do. We know that when you put four heads together for, I think it's like 15, 20 minutes, those two people are linked once you pull them apart, no matter how physically far apart you put them, no matter if you put them in radio frequency proof rooms, they can see what the other person's seeing. And it goes away very quickly, but they're connected. That experiment is done several times, right? So this is why it's very important when you build a paradigm in your brain of reality. You're trying to figure out the pieces and parts and the rules by which those parts interact with each other. You better be very careful. Because if you don't, you will lock yourself out of what you are. Now, I use terms on the show like soul, and you usually think of some Christian paradigm or whatever other religion acknowledges a spirit or a soul. I don't have another word for it. Your organized life force that is you. This consciousness that you can feel right now, this very second. In my brain now, I have sort of a back-to-front layers of consciousness that I acknowledge, and each one of them plays a different role. In the basement is all my long-term memory, but in front, there's the layers that I actively manipulate, the ones that are closer to me, and then the one out there is the movie theater. It's the drive-in theater where I'm sitting there in my car, with all the amenities of who I am, but I'm allowed to look out the windshield and see something on the big screen, maybe even hear it. I don't know. I've never heard voices before, really. Sometimes you can hear the intent of someone's thoughts. That's probably the closest I've ever had. But now what's interesting is when I started making the change, and I'm not sure how it occurred to me that this was not me. Actually, no, I do. Actually, now that I think about it live here on this recording, what was happening to me was that I was involved in a business situation with some pretty shady people that I had suspected were shady, but I couldn't prove it. But I was also connected to a partner, my founding partner, who was naive, lives in wishful thinking. And so if I was to be a part of the venture that I helped found, we had to exhaust these other resources that were not on the up and up. And, they may have even been self-delusionally unaware of their own lack of integrity. They may not be evil people. They just don't even realize that they're not really helping much. So it was very frustrating from time to time. Throughout the week, I was having, all this sort of, these guttural feelings, they say, trust your gut. My gut was saying, you're in a bad situation. These aren't good people. They play every once in a while, like they'll push you to the limit, and then they'll be nice, and they'll push you to the limit and be nice, and there's this process that people who manipulate you do, and they know the beat. They're masters at it. It's really sick, right? And so I would have these angry thoughts towards them. But what I was really trying to do is get resolved and essentially say, for me, I'm a pragmatic guy on these levels, and I'm like, okay, either you got to learn to accept these individuals for the way that they behave, or you need to just simply cut yourself loose and get out and go find people that are more integral and honest with reality, so that at least you can accomplish something in this life, because you don't get these years back, dude. And so for me, the chatter of hatred or the chatter of anger I would have towards these individuals was a waste of my time. It was the most definitive moment of like, wow, now I'm sitting here just boiling for no reason. I don't have any value to that. Because it's easy for me to say, I'm extremely talented, I will always create something new. People who steal and people who copy, whatever, they get that one thing, and then they're screwed because they're out, because they don't make anything new. I'll go create new things. I can change industries if I want to. So I started to consciously say, I don't want these thoughts. These thoughts are not logically what I create as a person, because I don't have any vested interest in this. It has no value to me. And so in that process, I started, I guess you could say, climbing back over the fence of the paradigm in which I thought these were my thoughts. At first, it sounds like you're mind-fucking yourself. Now you're just bullshitting yourself, and that's how you created this little paradigm in your brain. It's the new one you're talking about today. Well, I will say that my level of control over this process is reaching 90%. The first thing that happened when I started to reject this whole mechanism of wasting my time with thoughts that are not productive was that I physically could see them over there, and I'm over here. When I look at my whole life, I have never consciously, I'll tell you this much, I have never consciously stepped on someone's head to get ahead, ever in my life. Ever. Plenty of people have stepped on me. Not a ton, but enough. And I just will not meet my maker with that habit. I just won't do it. But then something started to happen slowly, because one, I pulled out of that situation. I found a new home where I could continue that research and continue my productivity and live in an absolutely positive, bright world with people who are brilliant human beings who have 10, 20 years experience in the stuff that I'm dealing with now. And so I have mentors now. I've just got really good people around me. And so, But it was a tough transition. It's always tough to pull out of something that you founded with this notion that someone is going to perhaps try to take your ideas and profit from them when they had nothing to do with it in the first place, right? The losers trying to be winners through theft. And what's funny is these folks are interesting. They rationalize what they do. They rationalize their theft. It's really strange. Now, in this particular case, nothing is going to be stolen, so it's fine. But I'm going to try to put this in an analogy because I'm still sorting out exactly how it felt and how it feels. But I want to kind of open up your consciousness to this other thought, which is if you don't know that there is a actual difference between seeing consciousness and actually manifesting consciousness based on your own willpower and your own character, your soul's true identity and true capability and its disposition to do things. If you don't make that separation, then again, you will own things that aren't yours. You'll own problems that aren't yours. But now, what if, because, I will say this, the only reason why you would, I'd say, reject something in your brain, which is where it becomes apparent to you that something's happening, is usually when you're thinking a thought that you don't accept. You don't, your morals don't agree with it. You don't really want to ever wake up being the person that would have that thought on a daily basis. You would never consciously try to manifest that thought. That's the kind of thoughts I'm talking about. So probably most of it is sort of dark stuff. And it doesn't have to be super duper dark. It can just be a little bit of like impatience or something versus something where someone's really making you angry. Hopefully your life is in a circle where you don't really have those thoughts, right? And I'm trying to sort out an analogy that isn't completely absurd to help you out, but I'm going to give you a silly one. But the way I'll describe this analogy, the one I'm trying to create in my head is, have you ever spited yourself without knowing you were spiting yourself? You were making a mistake. And you didn't know you were making the mistake. And so you're trying to accomplish something, and you're just screwing up what you're trying to accomplish. In fact, there was this video my buddy posted of a woman that is tasting the broth that she is cooking on a wok. And she has a ladle up to her mouth, and she is sipping off of this ladle. In her left hand, she has a spice or something, this bag of whatever that she's trying to put in, that she keeps putting into the actual source broth in the wok. So she tastes the ladle, she pours more into the wok, and she tastes the ladle again without taking the ladle back down to get a new proportion of the salt that's inside or whatever it's inside this wok. So the idea was that she wasn't doing this right. She meant to cook this thing better and make it taste better, but she wasn't doing it correctly. The analogy I was going to give you was, imagine you're trying to warm up your home. You turn the heater on, and it blows, gets you really nice and toasty, but within seconds you're freezing again. You're like, what the hell's wrong with my house? I was warm just a second ago, and you forget you left the back window open to your bathroom, the back door open to your patio, and all the hot air is getting sucked out of the house. So you're making this mistake. You're doing what you think is right, but there's this thing you forgot. Okay, keep that analogy in your head. Imagine you're opening yourself up to all these thoughts. You're trying to control who you are as a human being. You're trying to develop and get to the next level of consciousness. But you got the back door open, which in this case is the door right in front of your face. You keep looking at the drive-in theater, seeing things that are just passing by. And you're owning it when you should just be understanding that you're just observing it. But because, for me, I have 47 years of doing it wrong, I wouldn't say this happens even every day, but it probably happens every other day where I see something, and you get entranced by it because you're studying it. It's like, when you're watching a movie You're not necessarily all of a sudden paying attention to the theater as much, right? And someone has to go like this in front of your face. Hey, we got to get out of here. It's late. Oh, yeah. And they break your consciousness, your glue to the screen. That kind of happens when you start to observe reality. You start to observe consciousness. You start to see a thought. And if you're like me, you've been accepting that as your own construction. But how many times do we make mistakes after we figure out what we did wrong? Not too many times, right? Go to the air conditioning thing or heater thing, right? You're heating up your house, but it keeps getting cold. The second you remember that you could possibly have left a window open or a door open, the second you're on your sofa, all wound up in some really cool Deep Thoughts marathon. No, probably a Netflix marathon. You got the heater on, it gets cold, you're like, oh shit, I got a window open somewhere, I got the back door open. Someone gets up to get some more popcorn, like, could you check that door? Because I'm really cozy right here. Those mistakes stop happening. Your confusion stops happening. And what I have found is the more that you understand that you're observing consciousness that is simply manifesting out of the universe, you'll stop doing it. Or it's very simple to get yourself disengaged from the screen and go, oh, wow, that was wild. And what I have found is powerful is to say out loud sometimes, if it's more intense, just simply go, that's not my thought. That's not me. I'm observing that. Or you don't really say it so detailed, but you just kind of go, wow, that was interesting. That was an interesting little movie I saw. Ain't me, man. I'm at a point now where I can just do it inside my head. And again, it doesn't happen that often because the frequency of these things ceased to be so frequent. And what's beautiful is now my thoughts are mine. When I spend my time thinking by myself, I'm thinking about the script I'm writing or the business strategy I'm trying to hatch or something. It's all my time now. So I promised I'd talk about perhaps an evil source of this. And, I sympathize with those of you that would roll your eyes and go, oh, here we go. And again, you need to understand I don't walk around necessarily thinking about Satan. I don't. But then I struggle with the fact that we have to have a left to understand a right, a top to understand a bottom, a bad to understand a good. Now, as I've said in several episodes about evil, it's all relative, right? When you study acting and you study writing especially, you learn about the Francis Bacon / Shakespeare play Othello. If you haven't read it, let me just get you hip to it real quick. Othello has a beautiful wife. It is the wife of wives. She loves him, he loves her. Othello has some drama in his life. And he has a guy that he thinks is his best bud, sort of an advisor named Iago. Spelled with an I. Iago is a bastard. He starts providing this observed consciousness to the king in that he says, your wife is cheating on you. Where is she right now? You know where she is right now? She's cheating on you. And the king rejects Iago's assertions until he infects the king with this consciousness. It goes from an outside consciousness being manifested for evil purposes to manipulate the king, to going inside the king and him owning the consciousness and taking it to the next level. Where eventually at the end of the play, he believes his wife is cheating on him. Treats her like shit when she has been absolutely anything but loyal. She has been totally loyal to him, right? When you study Iago in writing, what they tell you is that from Iago's standpoint, he's not a villain. He's doing what benefits him. To him, it's a positive thing that he is manipulating the king to hate his wife, perhaps even kill her. And when they ask really good thespians, really good actors, hey, do you like playing evil characters? Is that what you love to do? A good thespian will say, I don't play evil characters. I play the characters. only from your perspective are they evil. But from my mind, to play it correctly, I'm completely serving myself. Lex Luthor. He doesn't think he's doing anything wrong. He's doing what he likes to do. If you were to play Lex Luthor, you would have to understand that perspective of his character. You can't come on stage and say, I am playing an evil person, I am playing an evil person. You have to say, I'm just this guy, dude. You know? I had a buddy of mine in high school, I've talked about it a couple times on shows, but he was a genius. Absolute genius. And you would look at him and think he was like a stoner. I think he was a stoner too, but he eventually got into crimes because he was so bored with everything that school had to provide, including all the most complicated classes that were ever taught. He'd just ace it and walk off. And it was like, you son of a bitch, man. Did you even study? And he's like, no, I just get it. I'm like, fuck you, dude. He eventually got himself murdered because he just, in his mind, he had ascended to a level that what was interesting to him was the thrill of a crime. Did he sit around thinking about I was hurting people? No way. You don't commit crimes if you think those thoughts. Usually. You know, the people that commit suicide after they commit crimes are people that actually do empathetically feel the destruction of what they did. They lost their mind, they got excited and retaliated. If you ever watch the movie Usual Suspects, it is one of the best movies Kevin Spacey ever made. Mr. Pervy Kevin Spacey, who again, from his perspective, all of the comings on he did to 14-year-old kids, in his brain, he wasn't committing any crime. He was just doing what he wanted to do. Never looked back, right? He's that kind of guy. He might repent and change his mind, but I think he spent the majority of his life doing exactly what he wanted to do. And of course, he's protected because people that would put him in jail do the same thing. But inside this film, they came up with a character called Kaiser Sose. And I won't spoil anything for you, but one of the things that Kevin's character did, because he's being interrogated at a police station, he's trying to give them all the information they need to catch the bad guy, is he said, you know, the greatest trick that the devil ever did was to convince you that he doesn't exist. I'm not so certain the devil's exists, and I'm not so sure that if he did exist, he has to work that hard to hide his presence in this universe, right? How many people worship celebrities, right? As if there is any benefit to doing that ever. If you don't understand how you were built and how you were put together and how the machine works inside the black box that's under the hood of your car, then if it's working good, you don't know, and if it's working bad, you don't know, and if it breaks, you don't know why. What I have found in becoming aware of this particular mechanism is that I'm in control. I'm in a lot more control of the inside of my brain. I am more peaceful because I do not take responsibility for random moments of consciousness that I happen to observe. I think that perhaps I suffered this more because I write. And when you write, you're constantly reaching out to the universe for scenario. What's going on in this scene? Why do I give a shit? Once you study writing even further and realize there has to be conflict that goes back and forth between positive and negative, positive and negative. See episode 7 if you want to understand this intimately. You sort of forcibly open the door to external consciousness that you then write down to hopefully make money and entertain people at some point, to expand thought through metaphor. I think that the story of Satan is actually fairly interesting for anyone, pardon the pun, struggling with their demons. Because what ends up happening is that you're able to, through that religious metaphor / paradigm, keep evil things outside of yourself because you feel like they're attacking you. And once you start to say, I am not this person who is having these evil thoughts or something, some type of thing. Again, I hope that very few of you have truly evil thoughts, but you have those moments where you're like, oh my God, I was so short in my brain towards that person, but I didn't say it. A lot of movies have done this, right? Well, someone will be standing in line for coffee and someone cuts in front of them and all of a sudden the movie continues where they Jason Bourne, this guy, down to the ground and break their neck, and then they go up to get their coffee, and then boom, we flash back to reality, and they haven't done anything. But the movie showed us what they were thinking. It's basically that mechanism inside your brain. I will tell you that the power of speaking out loud is really unprecedented for controlling the inside of your mind. And I know I've met folks that say, oh boy, if you ever talk to yourself for a split second, you're a fucking nutbag, and da-da-da. And that's because that's how their paradigm works. And then you look at their life and they're kind of out of control. I have a close friend of mine who has a driving phobia. This person was fine when they were younger, and as they get older, they're more and more terrified of driving a car on the highway. And I will say that, if you've never driven on California highways, it is definitely an intense experience. We have up to 8 lanes at times going in one direction. And people are, screaming in from the carpool lane. They're screaming to the carpool lane. They're trying to get to the fast lane. They forgot their exit. And so instead of just paying their dues and going to the next exit and turning around, they are driving over the median right in front of you, kicking up all kinds of debris on your car. I mean, it can be really intense. So I don't blame these people for having this phobia. I've met 2 women who had this issue. But my friend is tough and she's strong. And so she is saying, I'm not going to pussy out to this problem. I can't change the fact that she says to me, I can't change the fact that I get anxiety in the morning when I'm putting my makeup on. I get the shakes because I know I'm about to get out to my car. Luckily, she's able to travel everywhere in Orange County without having to hit the highway. And when they do have to hit the highway, the husband takes the wheel. And he's a patient, wonderful man who doesn't make her feel bad for having gone through this or going through this right now. But I sat down with her the other day, and we talked about it for the first time in really intense detail. And I just did, the friendly psychotherapy of just like, okay, tell me what the stages are of going through this issue. I said, tell me where you've had a lot of control. Have you ever beat it on a particular day when it was on you? And I said, well, what does it feel like when this anxiety hits when you're driving? Because there's one thing to have anxiety before you get behind the wheel, but when you get behind the wheel and grab the steering wheel, I said, I asked her questions like, do you feel like you don't know how big your vehicle is? Because she drives a fairly large SUV. She said, no, I can parallel park just fine. I don't have any problems getting around in the vehicle. I know where my fenders are. I said, well, that's good, because that's the first thing that really makes people a bad driver. So if they switch vehicles from a small one to a big one, and they no longer know how big it is, and they're bumping into stuff, right? Maybe that's where the fear is. Nope, not for her. She said to me something I'd never heard before, and what I love about her is that she's super intelligent and articulate, so I was able to hear something that you just don't get out of these people very often, right? And the other woman I knew was over 25 years ago, and the woman wasn't articulate and was scared of a lot of different things. So I thought, she's just a bag of problems. There's too much to sort out. You can't help her. But this most recent friend of mine, she said, and if you think about my dream episodes, this will ring a bell with you guys. She said, I'm holding onto the steering wheel, driving down the street, and she goes, I suddenly feel like my arms aren't really there. She goes, I lose the sense of touch on the steering wheel because my anxiety builds so much, it overwhelms my circuitry, and I lose a connection with my instrumentalities, my hands, my arms, my feet. So I got a foot on the accelerator. I know I can get it over to the brake, but it feels like almost like when your foot falls asleep and it feels like it's someone else's foot attached to your body, right? And in dreams, we don't really have our arms and our legs. We imagine them to be there. And I have a dream episode where I talk about someone asking me to write my phone number down. And my mind had to make my hands exist. And the more I tried to write, my hands felt like a wet noodle. And I didn't really have the 5-sense system that I have in this reality. And so I just willed my number onto the piece of paper, which kept changing and changing and changing. She's having that feeling in this consciousness, in this reality. I said, well, when have you ever beat this? And she said, yeah. She goes, she's not religious, okay? But this will make you chuckle. And it made her laugh because she goes, I almost felt like I was crazy. She goes, I have a relative that's very religious. And when I told her about me having this experience, she said, you need to pray to Jesus to get rid of this experience. And so it got to the point where shortly after having that conversation, and she's an open-minded person, which is another beautiful attribute of her, she's driving down the street, and it started happening to her, and she started kind of yelling out loud, she said, by herself, Jesus, get this away from me. And she said it, I guess, 4 or 5 times, and she goes, within seconds, it disappeared. Now, she says that when it happens, it's only like 10 or 15 seconds, but when you're driving, that could be the difference between life and death, right? But now here's the interesting thing. So she says this, and she said, I felt silly saying this because I don't have any major devotion to any religion. All of us were raised Catholic around here, and then we broke out. But she said it went away. And it went away, and then it didn't come back as quickly as it came back before she said that. And then she now sort of says the same thing. I don't know if she mentions Jesus in the second iteration, but talking out loud allowed her consciousness to ramp up, come to the forefront, almost like soldiers going to the border of the war, the front lines, and they're able to knock it down. But just the thing is, it was almost like training wheels, speaking out loud, were the training wheels to sort of reorganize how her brain works internally. And she looked at me and she goes, don't think I'm crazy, okay, for what I'm about to say. And I said, it's not going to happen. Go ahead. And she said, after I said that, it took this weird anxiety that I've always had my entire life, which is now a driving anxiety problem, and it made me feel like I'm being attacked by something. It's not a part of me. And then as long as I reject it consciously, it gets pushed away. It's breaking the habit, and it's building a paradigm of control. And that's what I want for any of you that are struggling with this sort of thing. And again, it doesn't have to be like you're struggling, you got to see a psychiatrist, or you're struggling and your life is misery. No. It's just that annoying goddamn thing that happens in your brain. You're like, God damn it, I just wasted 30 seconds of my life thinking about how to punch this guy's lights out. And I don't want to have those kind of thoughts. And I certainly don't want to have my time stolen from me by something living in my brain because I'm letting it in. Because before this, I didn't believe that there was an ownership model of the different pieces and parts of my consciousness, right? So I told her back, because she was worried about, even though I said I wouldn't think she's crazy, I wanted to prove to her that I don't think she's crazy. And I don't know how much I've shared. I think I've shared this in little bits and pieces in other episodes about perhaps the afterlife or something like that, but I have, a belief in reincarnation. I have a belief in, and this is through just listening to my soul and listening to my gut and listening to and keeping track of a chronologically taking care of the moments of inspiration and epiphany that have given me invention, given me creativity, that gave me strength to do the right thing, to perform better. If I'm going to go on stage and talk to a bunch of people, I believe that there's some mezzanine out there between life and death and resurrection that you can hang around for a little while. I don't think my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's still hanging around looking at me because he doesn't know me. He's like, I'll leave that to the generations that are closer to you. I'm going to go off and do this. I'm going to visit God for a little while, chill out, and then I'm going to go down and find myself a nice era in time to be reincarnated with a certain level of difficulty that I've never done. Maybe I take a break and become Steven Spielberg. Maybe I go in and become a child in the slumdog area of India. But if you've ever been stuck in a loop where your life isn't going the way you want it to, if you take the tack that you are going to bring in your forces, a lot of men definitely have had the emotion of you think about well, if you're an American, we're the big superpower, blah, blah, blah. And we have the best of everything, right? Navy SEALs and Delta Force and all these guys, right? And so you think about in your brain, well, I got my own Delta Force, I got my own guys that can fight for me and girls. Really genderless souls, I would say. And if you ask for their help, I think you can get it. And so I said, you're just asking for help, but you're also realizing it's not a part of you. And that's super important. And I will tell you that the most beautiful moment of our conversation, and we reviewed a lot of techniques for removing the anxiety and controlling her own tempo of her own thoughts. One of the things I mentioned to her, just in case it's useful to any of you, anxiety usually is a feedback loop of frequency, right? So you're getting a da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and it's like you need to be boom, boom, boom. And one of the things I've done, there was a physical thing I learned first that became a mental way to meditate, was that I was a lifeguard in high school, and I always liked to challenge my body. And being underwater for a really long period of time, being able to hold your breath and function was always a fascinating thing for me. And my city pool where I lived was so utterly massive that even though I could hold my breath and swim for at least a minute straight, our pool was so wide, like across, not the lengthwise. Lengthwise, you could never do it. It'd take you 3 minutes to swim this thing if you never stop swimming to get the lengthwise. But the width of it was so massive, it took 1 minute to get across this thing underwater. I was pretty buff and I could swim my ass off, but at the very end I'm exhaling and feeling pain. That's how wide this thing was. So what I would do is obviously take big deep breaths and expand my lungs and hold them and expand and hold them and expand. But inside my brain I created this beacon. It's sort of like those lights you find on antennas that keep planes from running into transmission towers, right? But they're a big piece of glass, like this big kind of like radio tube. They're red and they have like this metal cage around them so birds can't get on them easily. And I would see that thing and I would make this pulse, this nice slow pulse, and I could feel my heartbeat the more I held my breath, expanding my lungs, and I could feel my heart, and I would just see this red light throbbing, because it never quite shuts off. It's like an arc welding bulb in there or something. I don't know what the hell it is, but it never quite goes dim. But I would always make that red light slower than my heart. And eventually my heart, through my consciousness, would match the throbbing red, kind of soothing red lantern that is this cautionary beacon. Anytime I get my blood pressure taken, and I can feel my blood pressure in my bicep, I immediately, the second I can feel my heartbeat is the second I can slow it down. It's interesting, but it's because of years of doing this. But where I might be getting in some heavier frequency, I don't think I ever really have anxiety. I don't think I've ever had it, as you can tell on this show. But if it ever gets faster than I want it to go, I use that technique to slow it down. I told her, I said, when you're in the mirror in the morning and you're putting your makeup on, you feel that lack of control over your own frequency, because the shaking of hands is obviously the rhythm. Between every shake is a sine wave of how fast you're processing this terrifying thought. And I said, just stare into the mirror 60,000 feet, right? Forget your focus on your face and see the beacon and slow it down. Let the beacon be sort of the central processing unit of your body, of your mind, of your consciousness, and let it soothe you. And so by the time you get in the car, it's sort of like you had a whole body massage and you feel really good. It's hard to be really angsty and pissed off after you've had a full body massage. It's the truth, right? And let me remind you guys, because I say this every once in a while in shows, you could have a wife, a husband, and a bunch of kids, buddies, girlfriends, whatever, and you can get into an era of your life where no one ever touches you. And you get into these eras in your life where you don't consciously realize that your whole epidermis is tight. And you need to have, and your frequencies inside your meridians, your electrical circuits inside your glands and your body are all jumbled up. It's like a bunch of headset knots, it's like your shoestrings are all tied in big blobby knots, and you just need someone to touch you. The Russians have these clinics that do this, and they may or may not do any type of real deep tissue rubbing. That helps because it digs down inside your body, inside your muscle tissue, and gets everything straightened out. But I've seen Russian clinics where they just put their hands on you, and they'll go all over your head, and they're always pulling in top to bottom directions, always in the same direction, because your feet are the toxic end circuit of your legs, and your palms are the end circuits for your arms. But you'll find out that the people that are touching you in these institutions are usually very calm themselves. They're naturally that way, which is why they're led to be caregivers. And they just pull down the body. And these people will walk out. We have these places in California they call foot massage places. I've described it once before, but it's $15 for 1 hour. So you can tip them another $15, and they're happy as can be. But they're not licensed masseuses because they're from China. On their green cards, right? On their work visas. Or maybe not. But you stay relatively clothed during the process, and you're in a room with probably another 30 people who are getting the same treatment. So the hive mind in the room is wonderful. Like, they're playing, obviously, music. They got a water tank out front. So, it's all really chill. And they have you sit down, they do your neck and your back first, and then you lay face up, and they do the top part of you, and they make you face down. They finish the back part of you. You get up, you put your shirt back on, you're out of there, right? But when you're walking back to your car, as I've experienced several times, you feel like you have been liberated from your intense nature, and your epidermis is finally relaxing. And you'll sleep like crazy, man. You'll have the deepest, amazing sleep. Good dreams. Nothing will haunt you. The next day, you're just all relaxed and cool. And when you're relaxed and you're cool, you start to notice that everything else is going a lot faster than you. And that might sound like you've retarded your brain a little bit from processing information in an efficient way, but actually what you're doing is you're taking that step back. One of the greatest pieces of advice that you can get from anyone about having a conversation, especially a complicated conversation with someone, it could be business, it could be a relationship conversation, but it's one of those conversations where you could lose control of it and get excited in perhaps a way that you're excited, they're agitated, or whatever. And a lot of you know this technique, but it's called the pause. Someone is asking you a question, especially during interviews. This is very powerful. Well, do you do this? What do you like better, this or that? What do you think about this really tough scenario where you got an employee that's doing this? You're going to be managing some of our employees, so they got this scenario, and they put out a real complex thing out in front of your face. Or it's something that you usually knee-jerk the answer to. And if you just pause for a second, just think about it, and you're like, I don't know. I think that in my experience, this has been the best thing. Boom. The level of control that you exude from your being to the other person is extremely powerful. And they're like, wow, that pause feels like wisdom. The young kid would just go, blap, 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 all the answers. But as you get a little older, you're like, well, I know that sounds like a cut and dry answer, but we all know that there are contingencies to the cut and dry first impression. Maybe the first impression is correct, but you're going to think about it and confirm it against other techniques, right? What is that old technique if you get absolutely infuriated? They say count to 10. I know that sounds hokey and goofy, but geez, it works. It freaking works, Again, hopefully you've got your life in a situation where you don't have to do these techniques because you've picked your friends carefully. You actually make sure they're your friends. I've got an episode on friends, which sounds a little hokey, but if you listen to it, the people who have listened to it have really understood that even though I might give an episode a single word and it looks a little goofy, it has a lot of value in it, right? Observe consciousness. You don't have to own everything that goes through your consciousness. Understand that things are being presented to you because the universe is a big giant place with a big civilization where we do transmit information to each other. You could be having a great day and you go home and all of a sudden you're agitated for some reason, and there's no reason for you to be agitated. You're well fed, you've had a good sleep, your family's behaving wonderfully, your friends are good to you. Hell, maybe someone called you up and said, I just want to tell you you're awesome. And you're just feeling angsty and weird. For all you know, your neighbor is having the worst day of their life, and they're not in our circuit of control and trying to expand your mind and really control your destiny. And so they're over there panicking and getting crazy and what have you, and you don't realize it, but your office in your house or your living room is within hive mind reach of their brain. And because they are so insanely intense, that broadcast frequency out of their consciousness is really starting to sweep up the entire neighborhood. And the whole neighborhood can just go south for a night until that one person stops making it. But then you've got this viral infection. And if we don't all have control of our consciousness, that guy calms down within 10 minutes, but the neighbor across the street has anxiety for 2 days. The one thing I also want to mention in terms of detoxification, I wish I had remembered this at the beginning of the episode because I tend to lose people before the end here and there, is that sugar, which is very bad for the human body on almost every level. I know we all are addicted to it, and you do need to eat it. But just realize everything you eat gets converted to a sugar if it's not a fat. And as I always say, fat can't become a sugar, and sugar cannot become a fat. But sugar can hide inside fat, so be careful. But sugar is turned into energy in the body. And one of the things I told my friend, I said, look, you need to monitor your sugar intake versus this anxiety. And her immediate reply was, no, this is a mental problem, not a physical problem. I said, well, how do you think you manifest energy to run your brain? Calorie energy from sugar. And so be careful with sugar in the morning, sugar in the afternoon, sugar in the evening, and start to, if you have anxiety of any kind, or this process of observed consciousness that is not the kind of consciousness you want to have, take a moment and study when you last ate a bunch of sugar. At the same time, people are hypoglycemic. You can have a point where you're going into anxiety because you don't have any sugar, but the hypoglycemia and like a diabetic, when they need a little bit of sugar, they'll start to shut down and they start to lose all of their senses. Instead of getting anxiety, they start to go into a drony state. One of the most educated experiences I had, because in my video game company, I actually got a company called Diabetes Games that we made diabetic games, which you play the game just like a normal game, but it was teaching you about your diabetic habits that you need to have. You're testing yourself and all that kind of stuff. But I was in line at a Mexican restaurant at a mall, like the food court, with my good friend from work, and he told me he was diabetic. We talk about it. I ordered. I was in front of him. It's like one of these buffet things, And it comes time for him to order, and he is starting to shut down. He had hit a level of, I guess, too much insulin or something. And he is trying to say, slowly, I need a little bit of Diet Coke with real Coke on top. Again, we didn't know how bad Coke was back in those days, especially aspartame. And the beautiful thing is that everyone in line spoke very little English. They knew how to take orders. But the owner was obviously fluent in English and Spanish. And he just looked at my buddy. And I'm trying to understand him. Like, this is all happening like boom, like that, right? And this guy goes brrr in Spanish, man. And it was one of the most heroic, simple moments I've ever witnessed in my life. This girl at the soda machine, man, she did a cup, boom, bam, boom, handed it to him. He takes a sip, and within like 20 seconds, boom, he's back. And I'll never forget that. But I've also seen friends of mine are hypoglycemic, the opposite, and they have to keep little candy bars around. And they go into the opposite loop where they're stuttering and shaking like crazy because their body is starting to shut down. And it's a really odd thing that it goes in that opposite direction. You would almost think it'd be the opposite, right? But I've seen someone start to have this in a car, and they always kept a candy bar in their glove compartment, and I watched this woman start to just jitter, and she couldn't talk, and she didn't worry about it, but she was having this attack. She'd had it several times, so she wasn't inside probably panicking as much as her outside looked like she was, but she just reached into the thing and got the wrapper off and jammed it in her mouth, and she did well as well. Strange, right? But be aware of your energy consumption if you start to have any sort of these issues. We made it. We made it through the hour. That's cool. Well, hopefully this was valuable to you guys. Again, really interested in your take on this. I have not met another human being that has talked about this sort of thing. So if those of you listening have had this sort of understanding for years, please share your experience about when you became conscious of such a thing. Any other related research would be great to see it. Website URL or a video or something, that would be great. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. There's video and audio, locked Facebook group, and Patreon. So, for those of you who watch the show and support it, super appreciate it. If this is your first time, definitely like and subscribe. As they always say, hit the bell. If you're going to support me on Patreon, please also hit the bell, because I put a lot of effort into putting some stuff from MK Ultra up there, and I even put a little parody I did up there, a little comedy parody I did back in 2014, which I think is fairly funny. I played two voices, and it's always been fairly well received. It's kind of PG-13. But anyway, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you on the next sunny day. Over now.